All right, so let me introduce the topic. So this is strategy, and I'm going to go chapter by chapter. So the first chapter. So if my handwriting is not very clear, just tell me. And the first chapter is evolution of strategic management. So this is just a historical review. I'm not going to focus on dates or names either. I just want to place the topic in the in that broader context of different things that we have seen. So there was an evolution from something called business policy, which is basically what you mostly would understand, I guess, by management today, by very practical application of concepts into management. So obviously a warning, I'm not a manager, I'm an economist. I'm taking the perspective from microeconomics, from industrial organization, from organization theory. But it's actually, the idea is that these fields of economics, these fields of applied microeconomics, took the ideas of business policy and then transformed them in what we call strategic management. Strategic management. And I thought this class was very interesting, also to me, because it helped me to understand a lot of things that I had some doubts when thinking about economic theory. And I think it's quite applied too. I think it gives you a lot of ideas if you want to start a business afterwards. So this is something that in economics we usually don't see a lot, but I thought it was quite interesting. So basically this means that there's an evolution from some very empirical learning by doing, observation, to a theoretical field, right? To a theory-driven field. So basically, there's this movement from practice in business to theory, to microeconomic theory. So this gives us a lot of structure, and so it's transdisciplinary and or interdisciplinary, and as such, you have elements of management, economics, you have a little bit of finance. So this is what we want, right? We would like to have a subject that intersects these three fields, so I can get together all of you from different programs and have a common ground. I think this is useful, and I hope we'll be able also to build a little bit of community among University of London students at UPB, right? And there's a few things additionally that are outside of our fields, that are psychology, uh, uh, psychology, and a little bit of sociology. Sociology. And so the thing about transdisciplinary studies is that, at least at our level, they're usually not very complicated, because you need to have a lot of people from different fields talking a common language. And so that means that you need to do a lot of simplification, which I think it's an important exercise to be able to do, so that you're able to communicate with your peers, in other fields, right? So a little bit on the dynamics of the field. So we started in business policy, right? And business policy, so this is very, very, I think, despite the fact that it's something that started in the 60s, this is probably a common ground that is still established in most business and management programs, right? And so the importance is that, if you want, there is a difference and a shock between economics and management starting from this point. Because if you remember your classes in economics, a lot of the theory, mostly the theory in the 50s and 60s, was about perfect competition, and the fact that markets would be perfectly competitive, that they are Pareto optimal, that you don't have margins for profit, or that margins for profit are small, or if you have profits, it's because of the structure of the market. That is because either you have a monopoly or a monopsony or something like that. And so something that is neglected in the field, or that was neglected in the field of economics, was these ideas that come mostly from management, that there are differences between the firms, right? So one of the assumptions of mainstream economics, at least in the 50s and 60s, and still today, and still the introduction classes in economics, suppose a high degree of homogeneity between the firms. That is, they have the same technology, they have the same resources, they have the same management capabilities. And in management, you say the opposite, right? What makes a business successful, what makes a business thrive, is that they are different from everyone else. They have a competitive advantage, and this competitive advantage is based on a lot of different things. Like for example, you take into account the importance of the firm's resources, and managerial capabilities. That is, you put emphasis on the idea that not all the firms are the same, that you don't have homogeneity, that some firms are better because they have better resources, for example, better human resources. Their employees are more capable, have better education, or they're more motivated, and they have more dynamics. Hola, hijito, chao, hijito. So sorry about that. So you have like all these things that are a little bit undefined, and this is something that makes probably economists nervous, is that a lot of these things are not very clearly defined, but you have like a better mood in the company because, I don't know, you have a better corporate culture because you go to brunches on Sundays or whatever. So you have like these different resources and this availability of resources that makes firms different between each other. And managerial capabilities is the idea that the managers are different individuals, and these individuals, some of them are very talented, they have leadership skills, they have all this terminology that, again, in economics is usually not very well used, but it's very used in management. And management recognizes very early on that you have differences in people inside of each business, of each firm, and that these differences in people and this difference in the people that manage the firm end up making differences for the firm, as opposed to a mainstream economic theory where everyone is a rational agent, and because all agents are rational, they are all optimizing in the same way, and so they're all the same, right? And obviously this assumption in economics can be very strongly criticized. So what else? Another element then is bounded rationality. Right? So in economics, this idea that I have complete information, that I know everything that is going on, that I know all the prices of the market, that I know all the technology available, all of this is probably not very realistic. And so bounded rationality implies that, people are rational, they're trying to do the best that they can, but sometimes the information that they have available is limited, right? And another element, and so I know there's a lot of vocabulary here, is what the subject guide calls distinctive competencies. Distinctive competencies. So it's the idea that different enterprises will have different competencies. They will be able to do different things with different levels of competence. So some incompetent, some very competent, some in between, right? And that a lot of this can be defined by administrative structures. Administrative structures. Or in other words, that the architecture, the organization, the logic in which the business is organized can create differences, right? Sometimes, I don't know, maybe your hierarchy is too rigid, or maybe you don't have enough control on what employees are doing, or sometimes you don't provide the adequate incentives to employees or whatever. So how your business is organized can have an important impact, right, on how things work. So these are the ideas that we're going to explore. And again, these things were a little bit loose, a little bit undefined, a little bit, not very clear when originally defined in the 60s, because these ideas were there, but were not seen as too rigorous by the economics field. And as economists, we have a horrible reputation as that we are horribly arrogant, and we think that no one understands anything except economists. And so economists were very wrong on this point, obviously, because these ideas had a lot of value, but were not sufficiently recognized, right? So from the 70s on, there's like two emerging fields in economics that are going to be important and that are going to take into account these parts. The first one is industrial organization. Industrial organization is a very large field in economics, and actually the reference book for this class is a book on industrial organization. So the basis of this is industrial organization, and the idea of industrial organization is that you need to understand the structure of markets, right? It's understanding the structure of markets to understand why you have differences in profit margins between firms, right? The market is not perfectly competitive. You have some situations where you will have an oligopoly that will emerge, or a monopsony that will emerge, or a whatever structure of power market due to demand, due to technology. And so we're going to review these ideas. And then you need not the tools of perfect competition, you need the tools of game theory, and we're going to talk about game theory to analyze these markets. But again, the field of industrial organization considers still that firms are pretty much the same. They just operate in different segments of the market, right? And so if you work in this, if your firms are in the same niche, if they are offering the same good, then they should be very similar. And so we're going to criticize this idea. But at least there was already this idea that, perfectly competitive markets are probably very rare, mostly an exception, and that you need the tools of game theory to understand the structure of markets, right? And so you're going to talk here about things like, as I said, oligopoly, but also about things like, for example, collusion between firms, right? Strategic collusion, or the dynamics of competition between firms that are quite similar, at least within one market. And then the other branch, also in economics, is organizational economics. Organizational economics. And this field is mostly related to the ideas that come from institutional economics. So this is try to understand how institutions affect society. And so the main ideas here will be transaction costs. That is the fact that if I need to negotiate an agreement, if I need to bargain something, if I need to purchase some inputs for my production that are far away, that I need to find an adequate supplier of these goods. All these things are costly and take time, and so transaction costs can make some dealings too complicated or too expensive, right? And the other is agency theory, and some of you might be familiar with this. Agency theory, which is the problem, the agent principle theory problem, which is the idea of how we can organize the optimal contract between a boss and an employee, between a principal and an agent, when the principal doesn't know the characteristics of the agent, what we call adverse selection, or if the principal doesn't know the actions or cannot see the actions of the agent, what we call moral hazard. I think some of these ideas you might, I know that in economics you have seen them. In finance, I think you see a little bit of adverse selection and moral hazard. And in business management, I'm not sure. In those commercial engineering and business administration, I'm not sure, but we're going to review these ideas. So it's really about how you organize a relationship of hierarchy between a boss and an employee, and how you design the contract so that you align the incentives of the employee with the incentives of the principal. Both industrial organization and organizational economics have a big, strong mathematical background to it, so the theory is very developed. We're not going to look at very complicated theory in this class. The models are mostly toy models, or very simple models. But the ideas is what is going to be mostly important. And so we're going to discuss about these ideas during the class. And lastly, there's this more recent, not so recent, but more recent trend from the 1980s, what is called the resource-based view. And this idea is that, and there's a chapter that looks at this specifically. The idea is that firms are heterogeneous. And so the question is, what makes firms heterogeneous? And the idea is that you have some assets, that are not transferable, that are not reproducible, that are not movable. Basically, you have some advantages that some firms will have that cannot be copied by other firms. And so this competitive advantage remains there permanently. And so this would explain why you would have differences in profit margin, why you would have differences in the productivity of companies, as opposed to economic theory, where in economic theory you take this assumption of homogeneity among the firms, and the idea that if you have a competitive advantage, what should happen is that the other firms are going to copy that competitive advantage. And so the resource-based view is the idea that you have some resources that cannot be copied, that cannot be imitated, that cannot be reproduced or substituted, and then this would explain long-term differences between companies, right? And we're going to look at these ideas, but just to give like this bird's view of the whole concept, we move from a theory in economics in the 50s where all the firms are the same, and so there is no profit margin or not an excessive profit margin among the firms. At the same time, you have the development of business policy that has these ideas that, yeah, you have differences between the firm, and these differences come from, managerial capabilities or leadership or human resources or location advantages or branding positioning or all these things that you learn in business and management. And then you start merging the two fields so that economics begins to do a more mathematical, maybe you would say rigorous treatment of these ideas of business. And you add up more theory, including the ideas of industrial organization, the ideas of organizational economics, and the ideas of the resource-based view to have a more rigorous, more mathematical, more theoretical background to explain why you have differences in firms in firms' performance, right? And obviously, this is very interesting both for all the fields, right? This is very interesting for all the fields. Even if you want to start your business, you would like to understand how you can define competitive advantage, what defines a competitive advantage, what makes a competitive advantage more advantageous than other competitive advantages, what are the variables that you want to see in the market, etc. This is obviously interesting for finance too, because you want to see how is the performance of your borrowers and the performance of your own bank. And it's interesting for economics as well, because it's a very good and I think important criticism to perfectly competitive markets and the welfare repercussions of perfectly competitive markets. That's okay?
Yeah, it is quite clear. Thank you, Joaquin.
Okay. No problem. So this is obviously not that important, but it's just to have like this, to place this in the historical context. And so there's a very lengthy definition. I think what I'm going to do, I don't want to copy this by hand because, well, first because my handwriting is really bad. So I'm gonna cheat a little bit, and I want to read with you the definition that is on the subject guide. So those in business and management, have you seen principal agent models?
No, todavía no. Por lo menos no me acuerdo. Pienso que no.
Okay. Okay. I'm gonna take that. I'm gonna do calmly. Okay. So here it is. I'm gonna copy this. So because it's transdisciplinary, because of the fact that you have a lot of ideas coming together from different fields, the definition is quite large. So the nice thing here is that it's divided in the different parts of the definition. So the field of strategic management, and so this is the idea, right? The subject guide is called only strategy, but what we're talking about is, come on. What we're talking about is strategic management, right? And so what is it about? It's about what we call intended and emergent initiatives. That is the actions that are going to be taken. I'm going to tell you by whom, no? But the actions taken either by planification intended, so that is mostly the strategy part, that is what is your plan in the future, and emergent, your strategy is also going to be a reaction to whatever is happening in your context, right? So you need to have a plan, a contingency plan for whatever is happening next, right? Taking by who? By general managers on behalf of the owners. So here you see already one aspect of agency theory, that is that you have a hierarchical relation between the owners, the shareholders, and the manager. And not always you will have that the incentives of the managers are aligned with the incentives of the owners. The owners, what they want to do is maximize profits. So this is an assumption that is typical in economics and should hold true if the managers follow what the owners want to do. But sometimes if you cannot control your manager, for some reason you cannot monitor their actions, then maybe the manager will be doing something else. For example, building up a reputation for himself or herself so that he gets a better job afterwards, but he's not really looking at the interest of the shareholders, but maybe he or she wants to be more visible. I don't know, and doing a lot of talks and TED Talks and presentations and being almost a celebrity so that people would look at him, and he's not really taking care about business. Whatever, right? So we're taking into consideration the decisions of the managers, right? Which involve how they use the resources of the business. So resources are the technology, buildings, but also human resources, you know, branding, reputation, whatever you want. No, the objective of this is to improve the performance of the firms. No, to improve the performance of the firms. Okay, so this is really disaggregated. So to make the firm work better, to be more lucrative in their external environment. So I take into account my environment, how the market is behaving, how demand is reacting, how my competition is reacting, how potential complements to what I sell are reacting, etc. Right? So it's a very broad definition, but the idea is simply, what are we looking at? We're looking at how managers take their decisions, how managers design their strategies, they use the resources of the firm, they want to improve the performance of the firm, and they do this in reaction to whatever is happening in the market, right? Or at least they need to anticipate whatever is happening in the market, right? So given that, this is, you see, this is chapter 2. So it is really fast, and I think it's really easy. So so I think that is at least good news for now. I'm gonna keep this. Maybe you will need it afterwards. I'm not really sure, but right. So we can then go to the next point. So obviously, when you are reviewing, I suggest that you read a little bit of the complementary of the essential readings that are suggested. But again, I want to have like this this view, this complete view of the topic first, so that we understand what we're talking about. And mostly I want to help where I think I can be most helpful with the mathematical techniques, right? So chapter 3 is what we call, or what is named analysis of market structure. And the aim of this chapter is to provide a few practical tools to try to understand, in what environment the firm is operating, right? So we want to find some techniques to define if the market is very competitive or not, right? If I need to be worried about other firms in the market. Which firms? Obviously, this is an important question. And to which degree should I be concerned with this, right? And so there's two main parts. First, we want to see if I have a direct competition from another firm or from another set of firms. And then I want to see how competitive overall is the market, right? So there is in the subject guide like these three definitions of markets that they use. And I'm going to put this in color because we have three different definitions. The first one is what they call trading markets. And in trading markets, basically what you have is that you define you define a geographical area, right? Some location, which for some products could be the globe, right? So you just need to define it geographically. Where is this market, and then basically you expect the law of one price to hold. So this is the scenario of perfect competition, right? This is what you have in standard economics, in year one economics, in the introduction of economics that you all did, is that you have one price for one product and all the firms are sufficiently small or are sufficiently big to have an incidence of the market. Maybe you have a little bit of variation associated with the transaction costs, to the fact that you need to transport the goods from one part to the other. You need to, maybe if your location in the city is better, you need to pay larger rents, and then if you pay larger rents, there is a bit of the price of that cost that goes into the price. But the main idea is that you have like a homogeneous price that all the firms need to accept, that they cannot influence, so they're sufficiently small not to influence the price. And so decisions by the firm will not individually have an impact on the price. So this is sufficiently should be sufficiently evident, right? Then we have what we call antitrust markets. And according to this definition, what you have is that there is a high likelihood of a monopoly or a cartel, higher probability of a monopoly or a cartel. So there's market power that is embedded in there, and basically what you expect here, is that if there is a reduction in competition, that is, if a firm leaves the market, or if you have so you have the threat of this market becoming a monopoly, right? So you have a certain degree of competition, but if a firm leaves or a few firms leave, then you would expect an increase in prices, right? So this would be a market where you have market power, and you can define it by the fact that if you have one of the actors that leaves the market, or maybe two actors that merge, you have a collusion, or you have one firm that buys another firm, then you would expect an increase in prices. This is what we would call an antitrust market, because it's a market in which the policymaker needs to be paying attention to prevent the formation of trusts, right? Which is an old word for monopolies. So this is a market that most likely will be regulated by the authorities, at least in developed economies, and to a lesser extent in developing economies, right? And then we have what they call, and this is a little bit more modern, strategic markets. So this is an in-between. And in strategic markets, you would have that you have multiple prices related to multiple products. So you don't have one product, you don't have one price, you have multiple prices, you have different products, but products that are substitutable between themselves. So I'm not selling exactly the same thing, right? But there is a degree of substitution for consumer of these goods, right? So I don't know, I'm selling smartphones, and there is some degree of differentiation between the iPhone and the Samsung and the Xiaomi and the Huawei and the Samsung. Samsung, I told you already, I think. So there is a degree of differentiation between these products. They are quite substitutable. You have some consumers that will think that they're not substitutable at all. You have some consumers that will think that they are substitutable. And so there is an element of competition, but you have different products and you have different pricing too, right? And so basically the boundaries of the market, the boundaries of the market depend on the firm's offerings. This means that depending on the offerings, the proposal, the offer of the firm in terms of differentiation of product, in terms of marketing, in terms of advertising, in terms of branding, in terms of whatever, you will define if the product is sufficiently different from the others or if it's too similar. Differentiation obviously makes you tend to a less competitive market if you manage to differentiate your product sufficiently, but you will always have a certain degree of competition that remains, right? You have a certain substitute that is there. So the main idea is that you have a sufficiently good strategy to differentiate your products, then you define the boundaries of your market, and so your market can become more or less competitive depending on your own strategy to differentiate the product from other products. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, Joaquin. Thank you.
Great. So that means that there's different ideas, and so we need to look at different aspects of how markets work. We need to look at if the price of my competition are affecting my own demand. If they do, it means that I have a close competitor. If I have a close competitor, how do I get distances from this close competitor? Should I reduce my prices? Should I differentiate my products? These are basically the two main strategies, right? Either I try to reduce my prices, and to do this, I will have to find a way to reduce my costs, maybe by technological innovation, maybe by organizational restructuring, etc. Or I should try to differentiate my product from the others, and to try to differentiate the products from the others, what I need to do is to do more advertising, or maybe design a different product, or make some innovation that will allow the consumer to understand that my product is different from the others. But at the same time, if the market is too competitive, if I'm in a trading market, in which there's the law of one price holds, that means that everyone is selling the same product and the price is not going to be affected by my actions, I have low incentives to do any of these cost reduction or differentiation techniques, because I know that basically I'm not going to have an impact on prices, right? So, so I have to take into consideration also this. Maybe I have a lot of competition. No, I have a very, very strong competition, but sufficiently strong that the market is very populated. The price is not going to change whatever I do. So if this is the case, well, there's not much I can do. I can try to reduce my cost to increase my margin, my profit margin, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to try to take into account the actions of the others if I'm in a perfectly competitive market. If competition is not that intense, if there's not much competition, then I need to be more strategic, because I know that prices are going to change according to the actions of the other and according to my own actions. Okay, so first, do I have competitors in the market, right? Do I have competitors in the market? So to answer this question, the subject guide proposes a set of techniques. What's going on? Okay. So do I have competitors? Right. So this is my first question, and so there's a few techniques that I can use. One of the very classical ones, if I have a sufficiently large data sets, so the econometrics or the statistics are not very complicated, but I need to look at sufficient data for this, and I can try to compute the cross price elasticity of demand. Cross price elasticity of demand, and basically this is a measure of how does the selling of my product, so product I, changes when there is a change of the price of another product. So look at the subindexes, right? And so this is a cross price elasticity. So this is seeing how the price of another good affects my own sales, right? Or affects the demand of the goods that I sell, right? And if this is large, that means that we have a large sensitivity. So this is demand. So just to be clear, this you can take it in absolute terms, because the sign of this is negative, given that it's demand. If this is large, then that means that firm J is producing a very close substitute to whatever I am selling, right? If my competitor decreases his price a little bit, and this makes the demand for me drop largely, so this means that he's offering a very close substitute to whatever I am selling. And so this is not very good news, right? I have to be very, very worried. I have to be very preoccupied with whatever the other firm is doing, because if my demand, or the demand I receive, my consumers are very sensitive to changes in prices of the other firm, which is also good news if the other firm becomes more expensive. But I need to be a little bit worried if it becomes cheaper, right? If elasticity is low, then this is good news, because I don't have to worry so much about whatever the other firm is doing. Yes? So this is a way of defining how competitive, or not how competitive, but if I have close competitors to my firm, and if they are selling things that are close substitutes to whatever I am selling. Yes?
Yes.
All right. So if you want me to do some demonstration of these things, you always can ask. But I think elasticity should be, at least if you already did intro to economics, it should be quite obvious. The second thing that we can do is price correlation analysis. This is basically if I have a sufficiently long time series, so I need to track this over time. And then I need to compute the correlation between prices. Obviously, you can use, for example, a Pearson correlation where I can compute the covariance of the prices of the two firms. Let me put it like again, if this is close to 1, this is bad news because it means that I have a very close competitor, right? So the prices are moving moving together. And I'm gonna introduce a definition that we're gonna use afterwards, right? That if close to 1, we're gonna say that prices are strategic complements. No, again, this is going to be contingent. This is going to be important and contingent on whether the market structure is competitive or not, right? If the market structure is very competitive and everyone is selling at the same price, obviously the correlation is going to be very close to 1. But again, I don't need to think about strategy towards my competition, because if the low of one price holds, it's very competitive. That means that there's not so much strategy that I can take. If, on the other hand, there is not much competition, however, with the few enterprises that I'm sharing the market, there is a strong correlation between their prices, then I can see that they are competing each other, right? They're offering goods that are close substitutes between each other, right? So no firm is going to be selling exactly the same product, right? But I want to see if, on the eyes of the consumers, from the point of view of the consumers, these products are very easily substitutable or not, right? If this is close to 0, then I don't need to worry that much about price policy of the other firm. And if this is if this is negative, then things are interesting, because then prices become strategic. So the prices become, so there's a little bit of linguistic differentiation that we have to take care. Prices are strategic complements. That means that they move together, but they are strategic complements when the goods are substitutes from the point of view of the consumer. So make this differentiation, that is very important. So strategic complements refer to the co-movement of the strategic variable of the firm. So if the firm is deciding on prices, all firms are deciding on prices, and if they move their prices together, if I see that my competition increases their price, I increase my prices too, then we talk about strategic complements. But that doesn't mean that the goods are complements. The goods would be substitutes. That means that I'm aligning my price with my competition, mostly because the goods that we are selling are very close substitutes, right? So this flips. On the other hand, you would have that if you if your goods are complementary for the consumer, I don't know, I'm selling one firm is selling cars and I'm selling, I don't know, and I'm selling petrol, I'm selling gasoline, gasoline. I'm selling petrol, and the other is selling cars. If gas becomes cheaper, I'm going to be selling more cars. So in that sense, from the point of the consumer, they are, from the point of the consumer, these goods are consumption goods that are complements. And from the point of view of the firm, this is a strategic substitute in the sense that the direction would be negative, the correlation would be negative. If the price of gas goes down, I can increase the price of cars because people are going to be buying more cars.
Joaquin, I'm sorry. So complements have negative correlation and substitutes have positive?
So let me put three categories, right? So you have what we call strategic complements. And we're going to differentiate this with complementary goods. These two ideas are different. What is strategic complement? Strategic complement is that your strategic variable, so these ideas are going to come after, but I prefer to clarify now. Your strategic variables co-move. That means that your correlation coefficient is, let's say, close to 1. What this means is that your strategic variable, if your strategic variable is price, it could be quantity, but let's say it's price. This means that if your competition increases prices, then you would increase prices too, right? The prices are co-moving, and they can be going in the opposite direction. That means if your competition, for example, reduces prices, if Pepsi diminishes the price of Pepsi, of their drinks, Coca-Cola would have to diminish as well the price of their drinks, right? So in this sense, they are strategic complements because they move in the same direction. However, Pepsi and Coca-Cola are not complementary goods. They are substitutes, right? You can substitute one for another, right? In that sense, when you talk about strategic, and here the important word is strategic, is the co-movement of your strategic variable, right? While in complementary goods, these are goods that the consumer likes to consume together. And here, instead of having prices going in the same direction, what you would expect is that if there is a price increase in the complement, if there is an increase in the price of gas, you would expect that you would reduce the price of cars because you know that your demand is going to take a hit because gasoline has become more expensive. People are going to be demanding less cars, and what you would do is to reduce the price of cars given that, right? So the word complement appears in both definitions, but you see that they are the opposite, right? The first one refers to your strategic variable, the price that is fixed by the company or the quantity that is fixed by the company, and the other refers to the consumption habits of the consumer, right? It's a little bit redundant, of the consumer habits, right? And so this means that you would expect here your correlation instead to be negative. So these are complementary goods, which means that your variables are strategic substitutes, right? While here, if you have that your prices, so your strategic variable for the firm is prices, you co-move your prices with your competition. But if you co-move your prices for your competition, this is most likely because in the eyes of the consumer, these are substitute goods. Is it clear, the differentiation?
Yes, thank you, Jose.
Yeah. So I know it's a little bit confusing. So always make the distinction between what is strategic complements and complementary goods. Always make the differentiation between what is strategic substitutes and substitute goods. It's not the same idea. It's actually the opposite, right? So when we're talking about strategic complements, we're talking about the positive correlation, the positive co-movement of your strategic variables, right? While when we're talking about substitute goods, we're talking about the fact that the consumer can easily substitute one good for another, which means that for the consumer, it's very easy to replace one good by another, which means that the consumer has, so you have a high cross elasticity of demand. It's very easy for the consumer to go see another business if yours becomes too expensive. Yeah. Okay, so correlation is a relatively easy statistical tool, but you know that correlation can be problematic because you know that correlation doesn't imply causation, which means that you don't know if one firm's reaction is a reaction to an increase of price in prices of the competition, or maybe there's a third factor that is affecting all the prices at the same time, right? So maybe there is a third factor that is having is producing a hike in the prices of things. So in the book, I'm trying to remember the example in the subject guide, they take ice cream and sunscreen, and so you can observe a positive correlation. You have an increase of price in ice cream and sunscreen at the same time. They are probably not substitutes. Most likely they are complements, right? Because most likely you will try to eat your ice cream and put your sun cream at the same time, and you're not going to substitute, you're not going to eat your sun cream, most likely. So there should not be substitutes. However, we see simultaneous increase of prices, and this is because there's a third variable that is having an incidence on the two. For example, it's sunny, it's warm, it's summer. Well, not in La Paz, but it's summer, so it's warm. So prices are going up for both things. It doesn't mean that they are substitutes, right? So there's a little bit of caution that needs to be had when you are looking at correlations. Right, but you probably know these things, but a word of caution is always useful, right? Three other techniques that the book mentions very quickly, and then I'm gonna take a little break. So another technique is. So these three techniques are very, very easy. So the first one, let's call it the third one, is what we call diversion ratio analysis. And basically, this is based on survey techniques. When you ask, where you ask your potential consumers, where you ask a sample of people, if product A was not available, if product A was not available, which is your alternative? Which is your preferred alternative? And then we basically count the number of times. Now we count the number of votes that any alternative had, right? So I'm selling Coca-Cola. If Coca-Cola is not available, what would you prefer? I prefer Pepsi, I prefer Coca-Cola, I prefer whatever. And obviously, of my sample, I ask 100 people what do they think, and I see what is the percentage of those that say that they would prefer Pepsi, and if they prefer Pepsi and it's the one that gets more votes, then I have a measure of how close a substitute is that product, right? And obviously the higher the degree of substitutability, the more I should take into account the actions of that competitor in particular, right? So this is a relatively straightforward and simple way of doing this, with all the problems that surveys can have. Maybe they're not representative, maybe they're lying to me, maybe whatever, right? But it's a relatively easy technique to detect my first competitor, and also to have a measure of how intense is my competition, right? Maybe I don't know, 2% of my sample said their preferred substitute is, I don't know, coffee. Then I know that it's not such an important concern compared to Pepsi, right? So that's easy. Maybe I want to, so correlation, we said that correlation can be a problem. Correlation can be a problem because of causality, because of endogeneity. This is a little bit more technical, but if we can have an appropriate unexpected shock, what we call shock analysis, an unexpected change in prices can inform me, on the substitutability. Right? If I don't know, there's an unexpected terrorist attack in the Middle East that drives the price of gas up considerably. This was unexpected, so I have an external shock, and I can see if whatever oil-based, petroleum-based product that is a substitute from what I'm selling. I don't know, I'm selling some pomade, some cream for the hands, and my competition is Vaseline, and Vaseline is based on oil products. Then this shock could inform me if they are or not close substitutes. So this, I need to have a lot of luck. We need to have a good data analyst that can look at these kind of things and find some unexpected shocks to do this. You could do an artificial shock too. I think that some firms do this, that in the sense that you can have the firm that deliberately puts very low prices for a while to see how this impacts the behavior of markets. Even if this goes against the profits of the business, it could help them it could help them gather some evidence on how the competition behaves, right? So again, this is I mentioned it very quickly. I don't think in this subject you will see any sophisticated instrumental variable analysis using econometrics to solve this thing. So I just mentioned it by this, but the main idea is that if I have an unexpected shock in the price of my competition or in my own price, I can immediately identify the cause of this change of prices, and then I can see if this change of prices affects my own demand, and then I can infer if they are substitutes or not, if I should worry about this competition or not. Is that clear?
It's clear.
Yeah, okay. Last one is what we call bidding studies. And so bidding studies means that you look at firms that are natural competitors, and you look if they are bidding for the same market. That means if they're looking for the same suppliers, if they are looking to obtain the same concessions, for example, for the public market. For a public market. So, for example, if the state wants to, if the state wants to offer a concession for the extraction of lithium from Salar de Uyuni, I want to see which firms are competing for this contract, and obviously it's pretty obvious to assume that these firms are competitors because they're competing here, so probably they will be competing also on the other sectors because they're specialized in the same area, right? They focus on energy. So if I see that they are bidding for the rights to extract lithium from Salar de Uyuni, maybe I will see the same multinationals bidding for the extraction of lithium in the United States or in Argentina, or we have found that there's a lot of lithium everywhere. So yeah, that's not very good news, but but at least it's good news for the environment. But at least we see that by competing for something, for some part, it's probably that they're going to be competing on other dimensions, right? So if they're bidding for the same business, if they're trying to do lobby for the same rights, if they're trying to, or obviously if they're marketing to the same market, that would mean that they are probably very close competitors, right? So this is obviously this is very, very imperfect. No, the ideal would be to have a good computation of cross price elasticity. You need quite a few data points to do cross price elasticity, but then you can try to work maybe some correlations. If you're good and you have sufficient luck, you can do some shock analysis. Maybe you can do the survey for the diversion ratio analysis. This is probably the easiest and the cheapest. And then maybe for a very, very superficial analysis, you can see if they are competing on other dimensions, then they are probably competing for the same market too. Yes? Let's take a 5 minutes break.
Okay.
Joaquín, disculpe, ¿hasta qué hora va a ser la clase?
Hasta las 12 la teníamos prevista.
Ya, gracias.
Sí, no hay problema. I'm going to transition back to English. So some indexes of competitiveness that are quite easy to measure, that some of you would know, most likely. So first, this idea, do I have competitors, was the first question. And how direct is the competition with these guys? So it's maybe obvious that I have competitors, but I want to know the degree at which the competition is intense or not with them, right? So the ideal measure is this one of elasticity. A high elasticity of cross elasticity of substitution is obviously means that there's a very intense competition with this particular firm. And the other measures that I gave you can also give me an idea of how intense is the competition with any particular firm. Then the other measure is to measure how competitive are the markets overall. Right, so I want also an objective measure of how competitive are markets, and this is also something that is going to go from what is very easy to compute to more complicated things. So the first measure is basically looking at the number of firms, right? The number of firms. So the idea here, this index, we can call it C, is 1/n, in which the more firms you have, the more competitive should be the market. So this index C gives you the inverse of the degree of competition. And it should be quite obvious that that the more firms you have, the more competitive is the market. This is obviously not very interesting because it's not taking into account the size of the firms, is not taking into account the margins of the firms. So this is obviously something that we can probably discard. It is not very meaningful. So something that is more meaningful is the CN ratio. And what this does is it looks at the share of the market. So the share of the market, we're going to call it SI, which is basically the volume of sales, is the volume of sales over the of firm, right, of firm I over the overall volume of sales. So this gives me a measure of how much of the market is owned, and I'm gonna look only at the I don't know, at the 4 or at the n largest. I'm gonna look at the n largest firms here, right? So I maybe look at the 4, at the 3, and so this is why this n can be replaced by, I don't know, maybe value 3. So this is from 1 to 3 of the market share. So the market share of the 3 largest market shares, right? And the largest this index is, the more concentrated is the market. And obviously, if I have my C3, if I'm comparing markets between them, if the C3 in one market is larger than in another market, that means that there is less competition, and that you have more, so that you have a largest concentration of a few firms in the market. This is not completely satisfactory either, because we ignore those n-3 firms that are not the largest. So one of the most used and the most famous, and probably a lot of you have seen this already, is the Herfindahl Hirschman index, HHI, which is a measure of concentration of market power. And what this does is it sums the market share of all the firms in the market, and what it does is it takes the square of the share, right? Given that it's a share, obviously this is between 0 and 1, which means that if for one of the firms this is equal to 1, that means that this firm has all the market power, all the control. And if you have something closer to 0, this is going to be smaller, right? So I'm taking into account all of this, and basically by putting a square on it, I'm putting more weight on the firms that are larger, right? And so if I have a lot of tiny firms, then this is going to be smaller. And if I have a lot of if I have a few large firms, this is going to be larger. Yes. And the last one, you probably heard of this one too, is the learner index. And the learner index is an extension of the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, in which what you do is, again, you do the summation for all firms of the share of the market, and you multiply this by the markup of the firm. This is the price of the firm, of the product that the firm is selling, minus the marginal cost divided by P. So obviously this term here tells you if the firm in this market is getting large margins. If you have a big difference between the price and the marginal cost, that means that they have a lot of market power, and you're taking into account not only the share, but also the market power that the firm has. The learner index is the most complicated to obtain because you need to know the marginal cost of the firm. The price is observable, but the marginal cost might be private information of the firm or might be difficult to compute. So if you have very detailed data, it is possible to compute the marginal cost of production. But most likely what you would use in most comparisons of markets is the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, in which, again, the largest it is, the more, the less competitive it is. Yes?
Sí, Joaquín.
Okay, so that should be quite obvious. I think it's nothing very complicated. You probably have seen all of this, so I guess this is just this is a refresher, I guess, for most of you. Or if not, as you see, it's not that complicated. So what I'm gonna take another one. So I think we're getting into the mostly technical, important, and hopefully interesting part. So this is going to be a reminder of game theory. And so the challenge is to make this very, very quickly and defining the biggest elements of game theory. So this is chapter 4. So this is chapter 4, and this is introduction to game theory. All right. So typically we're gonna divide game theory, at least at our level, in so there's two broad categories. There's cooperative game theory and non-cooperative game theory. We're going to be looking at non-cooperative game theory. So I'm looking at competition between firms. So we're going to take the perspective always of the firm here. And you have static games and dynamic games. So dynamic games are going to be important in this. And in static games, you all know we typically have the following presentation. So first, we need to know what are the ingredients for a game. So the ingredients are, we need players. So who's going to be participating in this game? Typically, it's going to be firms, and a given number of businesses. Then we have what we call the actions of players. So this is what they can do. And from these actions, we're going to try to infer strategies. So in the basic static setting, actions and strategies are going to overlap, but a strategy, basically a strategy is a plan of action. It's what action I'm going to take in response to whatever the other playing is doing, right? And with this idea, the actions is what I'm allowed to do, right? And the strategies is it's a little bit more sophisticated than what I'm allowed to do, but it's most what I'm going to do in reaction to something that happened, right? So a strategy is a reaction, yes, and the action. So if you want, the strategies is a subset of the set of actions. The set of actions is the things that I'm allowed to do, and the strategies is the plan of my reactions to whatever is happening. And a strategy can be a bad strategy or it can be a good strategy. A strategy is just a plan of how I'm going to react to the actions of the others. And finally, I need payoffs. I need to know what is the reward for the reward or the sanction and how much I'm going to gain from the results of the game, right? So let's begin with static games. These are games that are played simultaneously between the agents, and or one way of thinking about this is either they're playing simultaneously, they're playing at the same time, or the actions of the other player are hidden. So I cannot see what the other playing is doing until I result. Sorry, my connection is a little bit. What happened? Yeah, all right. And so the typical representation is what we will call the normal representation of the game. Presentation of the game, which is in matrix form. So you probably all know this. This very unstable connection. Okay. Let's hope that things get better. And so an example that is used in the book is an advertisement war. And so so you have two companies. So I'm gonna take the example of the book. You have Procter & Gamble and you have Colgate. So these guys are selling toothpaste, so obviously very close substitutes. And the idea is that you could have the following payoffs. You could take two actions. No advertisements. So you don't have an advertisement campaign, or you do an advertisement campaign. The idea, I think, here is that you know, people are going to buy toothpaste, whatever you do. The demand for toothpaste should be quite inelastic. But you have very close substitutes, so they should be very sensitive to changes in advertising, and changes in advertising are going to pay off if you do it individually, right? So, for example, you get a payoff of let's say $5 million if no one is doing advertisement. So here I'm putting the payoff of player. So this is player 1 and this is player 2. I'm putting the payoff of player 1 in the lower left corner and the payments of player 2 in the upper right corner. If there is an advertisement campaign, if there is an advertisement campaign, so player 2 gets a larger share of the market, right? 5.5, and the Colgate did not advertise anything, so their sales go down and they get a payoff of 2. And so notice that in the first payoffs, you had an overall profit of 10, and in the second you have an overall profit of 7.5. This is because there's money that has been spent in marketing, right, on an advertisement campaign. So this investment in advertising is providing a return, but it's not but you don't get all the market, you don't get all the profit that you get adding up the two in the no advertisement equilibrium, if it exists, because you spend money on ads, right? Things are going to be symmetrical. So if player 1 does advertising and player 2 does not, he gets a larger share of the market, and the player that did not advertise loses a share of the market. And if they both do advertisement, then you'll get a payment of 2.5 for both, because both are spending money on advertisement, but the campaigns cancel each other out, so the payoff at the end is the same for both, right? This has the structure of prisoner's dilemma. So all of you are familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, and these advertisement wars are an application of a prisoner's dilemma. And a real life example of this was when advertisement for cigarettes was banned. And this actually was good news for the cigarette companies, because they had to reduce their their budget in advertisement, but at the same time they had something that guaranteed that their competitor was also reducing the expenditure in advertisement, which made that profits for all the companies increased initially with a ban on advertisement from cigarettes, mostly because consumers of cigarettes have a very inelastic demand, because it's an addictive product, and given that it's inelastic, basically people kept on buying cigarettes, at least in the short run, following the ban of advertisement from tobacco companies. Right, so there's different ways of solving this. The first one is what we call by retention of dominant strategies. So solving the game. So one is keep dominant strategies. And so I look at the strategies of the agents, and I see if there is a particular dominant strategy. If I look at player 1, he can choose between advertise or not. If he advertises, the payment is 5.5 versus 5. If player 2 is not advertising, here it's 2.5 versus 2. So you have a dominant strategy, right? Advertising is a dominant strategy. Whatever the other agent is doing, advertising is always better. And for player 2, you have the same, right? He compares 5.5 to 5. So advertising is better. He compares 2.5 to 2. So advertising is better. So this is a dominant strategy. And then we see that in my dominant strategies here are advertise, and this is one solution of the game. You cannot always have strictly dominant strategies. Here it's the case. It's the case for the prisoner's dilemma, but it's not always the case that you will find dominant strategies. So the other possibility is to remove
dominated strategies. And if you remove dominated strategies, well, the idea is very similar. We're going to see cases where things are a little bit more interesting, where you remove, no, again, if advertising dominates not advertising, you remove not advertising. The same will happen here, and then again you will get the solution. So that's the second way. It's the second way that you can solve this kind of problem. And most importantly, you're not always going to get dominant or dominated strategies. So the technique to solve this is look for a Nash equilibrium. And if you look for a Nash equilibrium, what you need to do is to look for the best responses of an agent to whatever the other agent is doing and see where the best responses coincide. So that means, and I'm sure this is super familiar for all of you. If not, please interrupt me because this is something that you need to know. So I'm looking for the best responses. So I'm going to start with player one. Player one, if player two plays no add, what is the best response for player one is to play add. This is first best response. And if player two plays add, my best response for player one is add again, right? And then I'm going to look for the best responses for player two. So for player two, if player one plays no add, my best response is add. If player one plays add, my best response is add as well. And so I'm looking at the point in which the best response to the best response of the other player are the same, they coincide, right? So this is my Nash equilibrium, which in this particular case coincides with keeping dominant strategies, coincides with removing dominated strategies. Sometimes this is possible, sometimes it is not possible. But to compute a Nash equilibrium, what I need to do is find the best, where the best responses of all the players involved coincide. Yes, this is obvious and easy for everyone.
Joaquín, lo de los dominated strategies, ¿por qué los no ads eran dominated strategies? No me acuerdo muy bien eso. ¿Por qué se consideran, por así decirlo?
So they're dominated strategies because if you look at the strategy add and no add for player one, you see that no add is always worse than at least one strategy, right? You can always do better than no add, right? If you play add, you're gonna get 5.5 or 2.5 instead of 2. So you always have something better that you can do. We're gonna look at another example in a moment that is a little bit more useful than this one. But the main idea is that a dominated strategy, or at least a strictly dominated strategy, if you always have an alternative that does better, then you can remove this one, right? For the moment, there's only one alternative, so there's nothing too interesting to say. But if I have several other actions that are better than one action, so this action is dominated, then you can remove this one. And I'm going to show this in an example in a moment. Yes?
Okay, perfecto, gracias.
No problem. Okay, so the definition of Nash equilibrium, there are two main definitions, varying in the degrees of rigor that you use. Normally for my micro classes, I use something a little bit more rigorous. But for what we need here, basically, we can say that a Nash equilibrium in pure strategies and I'm going to mention what is impure strategies. A Nash equilibrium in pure strategies consists in a set of strategies in which the best response of all players coincide. This is one definition. You have other definitions. You have more mathematical rigor. I don't think it's worth going into more mathematical rigor for this one. So basically, you need a coincidence. You need an intersection. Maybe we can say coincide or intersect. You have a you have that the best responses coincide in the same set of strategies, right? The second definition is that a Nash equilibrium is a set of actions from which no agent has an incentive to deviate unilaterally, right? So these two definitions are equivalent. The first one is that both best responses coincide, and the other one is that agent one has no interest in moving up because it's going to get worse, and agent two has no interest in moving there because it's going to get 2 instead of 2.5. So they don't have an interest to deviate unilaterally. Both definitions are okay. The subject guide focuses on the second definition, probably as a matter of simplicity. The first definition is considered as more rigorous and more general, and probably more useful for the things that will come afterwards, right? But both definitions are okay. So another example. This was fun for me to see. It's called Pizza Wars, and the setting of this game is the following. So we have two pizzerias. And we're gonna call them. We're gonna call Pizza Paul and Pizza Dave. And what they tell me is that you have 1,000 customers, and you have, of these 1,000 customers, you have 300 that are loyal to Dave. You have 300 that are loyal to Paul, and you have 400 that are price sensitive. That is, that they would switch from one company to the other. They would switch from one company to the other if the price is cheaper, right? So there's no quality considerations here, no location considerations. Everything is very, very simplified, right? And the set of available actions is the following. They can price their pizzas at 12 pounds. They can price their pizzas at 10 pounds, and they can price their pizzas at 5 pounds, right? So I want to build the payoff matrix, the normal form of the game. This is all right. Try to do something a little bit straight. And so I have Paul and I have Dave, and so the strategies is I can put a price tag of 12 pounds, 10 pounds, 5 pounds, again 12, 10, and 5. So an additional assumptions that I didn't say, that if the prices are the same, each gets 500 customers, right? Because for those that are price sensitive, for those 400 that are price sensitive, if the prices are the same, then they're gonna go to the same place. Sorry, they're gonna divide half and half between the two places, right? So let's compute the payoffs for 12 pounds. So you're gonna have an evenly distributed market, 500 with one and 500 with the other. The price is 12 pounds, so the profits are gonna be 12 times 500. This is 6,000 pounds, 6,000 pounds of profits, given that it's 500 times 12. I'm gonna work on the diagonal because it's a little bit easier to think about this. So half and half again, 500 for each one at 10 pounds. That gives me a profit of 5,000 pounds of profit. And finally, if I get a price of 5 and 5, given that we have again 500 for each other, this is gonna be 2,500 for each one, right? So this is the diagonal. Is it easy to construct because everyone gets half of the market. If I look at, let me look at what is on the inferior left part of the matrix. So here I get that the prices of Dave are always lower than the prices of Paul. What is going to happen is then that all the price sensitive consumers are going to buy at Dave's. So he's gonna get 700 customers. So here the 700 customers of Dave, here they would be paying 10 pounds. This is 7,000 pounds. If they get, if the price is 5, so I have 700 times 5. This is 3,500. Please tell me if I'm making any mistakes. And here, if again I get all the price sensitive consumers, 700, and so this is going to be 3,500, right? For player 2, so if I'm losing the price war, I keep only my 300 loyal consumers. My 300 loyal consumers here are paying 12 pounds. This gives me 36,000. Here is 36,000, and here if I keep 300 consumers at 10 pounds, this is 3,000, right? And then things are symmetrical, and because things are symmetrical, I can just copy the things in the diagonal. So this is going to be reversed. This is going to be reversed because things are symmetrical. This is 3600 and 3500, and here it's symmetrical too. So this is 3,000 and 3,500. Correct?
Sí.
Good. So it takes a little bit of time to build up the matrix, but let's work with elimination of strictly dominated strategies. Let's work with elimination of strictly dominated strategies in what we call iterative elimination of strictly dominated strategies, IESDS. Yeah, I know it's a little bit of a mouth, but it's an iteration because what I'm going to do is eliminate one by one strictly dominated strategies, right? And so I need to look for this. Let's start with player one. Do I have a strictly dominated strategy? So if I look at pricing at 3,500 is worse than whatever it's up here. 3,500 is worse than whatever I have here. And it's also worse than whatever I have here. It's actually dominated by both strategies. It doesn't need to be dominated by both strategies. It could be dominated in one column by one and in another column by another, right? Here it happens to be that it's dominated everywhere, but it could be that it's dominated by in different columns by different strategies, right? So this point is a little bit important and delicate. If I have a strictly dominated strategy, strictly means that I don't have to have equal values. It's always strictly large, but it could be that I have that it's dominated here and dominated here. That is enough to say that it's dominated by different strategies, not necessarily by exactly the same. Yes. So this one is dominated. We can remove the strategy. For player two, so first I eliminate for player one a strategy, then I have a reduced game in where I have a game that is 3x2. In this reduced game, I can also eliminate this strategy. Why? Because it's dominated. It's dominated both by 12 and by 11. It is dominated. It is also dominated by 12 and 11 here. So this one is strictly dominated. I can get rid of that. Then I turn back to player one. And when I turn back to player one, I see that for player one, 12 is dominated. 12 is dominated by 10. So I can remove the strategy too. And for player two, I see that 3,600 is less than 5,000. So I can also eliminate this. And then I remain with my equilibrium, right? I remain with my equilibrium. So this technique of iterated elimination of strictly dominated strategy could either reduce the game so that the game is simpler to solve, or can even lead me to the equilibrium of the game. Yes? So everyone understand how this mechanism of iterated elimination of dominated strategy works?
Yep.
Hopefully. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So that's one technique. Strictly dominant strategies. I don't know if strictly dominant strategies here it's a problem, because let's look at player one. Let's so 10 is better than the other two. 10 is better than the other two, but 10 is not better than 12 if the other is playing 5. So I don't have a strictly dominant strategy here. So strict dominance here doesn't help. I cannot go forward with strict dominance. What I can always do is Nash. So Nash is looking for the best the best reactions of all the players. So what are the best reactions here for Dave? If Paul plays 12, my best reaction is 10. If Paul plays 10, my best reaction is 10 again. And if Paul plays 5, my best reaction is 12, right? And well, things should be symmetrical. So if I take the perspective of Paul, if Dave plays 12, the best reaction of Paul is to play 10. If Dave plays 10, the best reaction of Paul is playing 10 again. And if Dave plays 5, my best reaction is to play 12. Again, we see that at this point, We have a coincidence of the best responses at the strategy 10 pounds, 10 pounds. So this is the Nash equilibrium in this game. And you can verify that it's a Nash equilibrium because no agent has an incentive to unilaterally deviate from this point. So they're gonna stay there. That's okay.
Yes.
Good. There are three classic games. There are three classic games that is worth knowing. That is worth knowing by heart, and these are the chicken game, the battle of the sexes game, and matching pens. So let me just draw very fast three matrices. I'm sorry that they're a little bit irregular, but I think it's okay. So the first game is called Matching Pennies. Matching Pennies is a game in which you should, you know, there's two players and they show, they show the face of a coin. They show a coin at the same time simultaneously. If they match, player one wins, and if they don't match, player two wins. So let's call player one and player two, and let's say that player one can play heads or tails, player two can play heads or tails, and if they match, if they play the same thing at the same time, player one wins and player two loses. And if they play different things, player one loses and player two wins. So you probably all have seen this. And if you look for Nash equilibrium here, so you won't find dominated strategies nor dominant strategies. If you look for Nash, so let's look for the best answers. Two heads, two heads by player two. So sorry, if they match, player one wins. If they are different, yeah, okay. So if player two plays heads, my best response as player one is to play heads. If player two plays tails, my best answer is to play tails, obviously, because I want to match. And then for player two, if player one plays heads, I want to play tails, and if player one plays tails, then I want to play heads. And what we see here is that there is no coincidence of the best responses. There is not a Nash equilibrium, not at least in pure strategies. There are some elements, and maybe some of you remember that you can solve this using mixed strategies. The guide doesn't contemplate mixed strategies, or we're not going to go into mixed strategies. And so here you don't have no Nash equilibrium in pure strategies. So it is possible not to have an equilibrium in pure strategies. So this is a game, and it's a game of that one agent wants to do something, he wants to match, the other player doesn't want to match, and this will end up in no Nash equilibrium in pure strategies. The other famous game is the Battle of the Sexes. Right, so you know the story. There's a husband and a wife, and they want to go together somewhere, but they want to go together somewhere. Maybe one of them has a slight preference for one of the events. So let's say that, sorry, this is player two and this is player one. So they can go box to see the box match, or they can go to the opera. It's obviously completely indifferent who's the husband and who's the wife. And if they go together, I don't know, player one gets a larger payoff. If they go together, but to the opera, player two gets a larger payoff. And we can say that if they don't match, if they don't go together, if they don't go to the same place, they lose, both lose, and they don't win it, right? And here we can look also for Nash equilibrium. So what's the best response of player one to box? It's to go to box. What's the best response of player one to opera? Is to go to opera. If we do this for the other one, for player two, what's the best response of player two to box? Is box. And what's the best response of player two to opera? Is opera. So here what we see is that there is a possibility of multiple Nash equilibria. Multiple Nash equilibria, because it is possible that you have many equilibrium. Well, here it's two. There is also a mixed strategy in Nash equilibrium here, but we're not looking at mixed strategy. So here you have two equilibrium, and so the concept of Nash equilibrium allows the possibility for multiple equilibrium to exist. And this is obviously, from a theoretical point of view, very important, and I'm going to discuss that in a moment. And lastly, the other famous game is the chicken game. Is the chicken game, and in the chicken game, what you have is that you can you have two cars going one in front of the other, and the idea is that you want to see who's chicken. That means that if one of the two deviates from the collision course, he will be considered chicken. So this is very inspired by the movies in the 50s, by James Dean movies. So we can have like let's say that you can have deviates are not deviate. You can have deviate or not deviate. And so this is important because it has industrial applications. That is, do I continue with an aggressive industrial policy? I expand my production a lot, I diminish my prices a lot, or I should be prudent with what I'm doing. And so the payoffs are the following: if neither of those deviate, if they get into a collision, then they both, lose a lot. They lose a lot. Player one and player two lose a lot. If they deviate, they look a little bit silly, but they are alive, so that's good news. And in this game, if player one deviates, he looks like a chicken, and the other feels like a rooster because he did better. So player two feels a little bit emboldened because he was very courageous, and things are symmetrical, right? So courageous and stupid at the same time. It often coincides. So if whether it's a Nash equilibrium, if so I'm playing player one, I'm starting with player one. If the other guy deviates, if the other one deviates, my best strategy is to not deviate. If the other player decides not to deviate, my best strategy is to deviate. And we have looking at the strategies of player two. For player two, the best reaction to the player one deviating is not to deviate, and the best strategy for player two from agent one not deviating is to not deviate, to deviate, sorry. So again, I have multiple equilibrium, and this is a lesson, let's say, in which this is a lesson in which if you have two companies that are going into war of prices, it is most likely that in equilibrium, one of the companies is gonna get out, is gonna avoid this problem, right? There is also a mixed strategy here where you randomize your decision to remain or not. But what should happen is at the end of the day, you don't get, or at least you don't predict a catastrophic collusion, catastrophic impact. Right? So also multiple equilibrium that are possible, right? And this lesson is important. And if you have multiple equilibrium, you have refinement. So the Nash equilibrium concept only gets to that point in which they tell you you have multiple equilibrium that are possible, and these are the multiple equilibrium that we can predict. There is, however, extensions of the Nash equilibrium, at least the Nash equilibrium in pure strategies, that tell you that there might be a selection outside of the game of either of these two equilibrium, right? And this selection can come from different institutional or social factors that are around you, right? So one of these is, for example, hierarchy, right? I don't know, maybe in the battle of the sexes, if you have the two husbands, the couple that wants to go to box or opera, they want to go together. Maybe there's some marriage dynamic where one part of the marriage is more dominant than the other by tradition, somehow imposes more the rules, whatever. Maybe it's more likely that one of the two Nash equilibrium would be selected because of this potential hierarchy between the marriage, right? Or maybe also in the chicken game, you have someone that is more dominant for some reason, because, I don't know, of reputation. It could be reputation, it could be history, right? In terms of history, a famous example is that you could have your traffic either where all cars drive on the left or all cars drive on the right. The example of the United Kingdom and I don't know, and let's say the United States shows that you can have both equilibrium, and that historically you keep on driving on the left or driving on the right. This is self-enforcing. Obviously, you don't want to drive on the wrong side of the road, but it shows you that both equilibrium can happen, both equilibria can happen, and that history can be determinant in which of these equilibrium you remain. So these are the possibilities. Another possibility that we're going to look a little bit further is commitment. So you might have an agent that is more committed to remain in one equilibrium, right? We're going to look at that when we look at dynamics, but it could be that I arrange things in a way that if you don't go to the equilibrium that I want, I'm gonna inflict a sanction on myself, so that in reality I have, in reality I have no incentive to remain in one equilibrium. So you could imagine, I don't know, one of the people in the couple, player two doesn't want to go to box that much, and maybe he will say something like, if you take me to box, I'm gonna jump off a cliff, and so I'm gonna change my payment. I'm gonna make you believe, or I can commit in some way that I'm going to jump off a cliff if you take me to box. And so this makes this creates a serious commitment not to play box, and then the equilibrium is going to become this one. We're going to show that in a minute, but it could be a possibility that you find a device so that you don't play one of the equilibriums. And the last one, again, I'm not going to go into the mathematics of this, is the mixed strategy. Equilibrium, in which instead of playing one strategy for sure, instead of taking an action for sure, I randomize my actions. I play box and opera with some probability. I play box with a probability, I don't know, of 60%, and opera with a probability of 40%. And so there is this concept of mixed Nash equilibrium, in which agents randomize their strategies, and actually the strategy is to pick the appropriate probability. No, how much should I, with how much probability should I play one or the other? Is it 60%? Is it 61%? Is it 62%? So agents optimize the probability of playing one or the other. So we're not going into the details, but you should know that this exists, right? Economists should go into the details because they're going to have that in micro, but for the others, it's not necessary to go into the details. It's just the idea. One example famous for this is, suppose that you're playing penalties at the end of a football match, and so you can either kick to the left or kick to the right. The goalkeeper can either dive to the right or dive to the left. And obviously, it's not very interesting if they're always playing the same strategy. If they all play left, then there's no goal, and then that is not very interesting, right? Or what you probably want is, with some probability, kick to the right, with some probability, kick to the left. The same for the goalkeeper, because obviously if he knows that the kicker is randomizing, it doesn't make any sense for the goalkeeper to always go to the left, given that the other one is randomizing, right? So this is an example where your strategy could be to assign a probability to each of your available actions. Is that okay?
Sí, Joaquín.
Okay, great. So let's do some dynamic models. So let me see. Is this? So this is really a refresher, right? It's a very simple refresher, but it's the moment to identify if some concepts are not known, then it's a good moment to identify how to work on these ideas. Good. Dynamic games. Typically, when we have dynamic games, we're going to have a structure in the form of a decision tree, right? And where you could have, again, an example could be advertisement wars, right? So we have like two players, player one, player two. These are decision nodes. And at the end of the tree, we put the payoffs. And so agents could choose between a high level of expenditure in advertisement or a low degree of expenditure in advertisement. And if they both spend, I'm gonna put on some values. If they all spend all the money in advertisement, they win 0 because they spent all the money in advertisement. If only player one makes an ad campaign, he gets to win 1,250,000. I'm going to put it like this. The other one loses. He doesn't do any advertisement and he wins 500,000. things would be reversed, if player one does not do any advertisement, and things would be and if only player two does advertisement, he wins more than 1 million. And then we'll have that if neither of them do advertising, they win 1 million each. So typically, then you probably remember this, you solve this by what is called backward induction. So basically you look at the sub games, so a sub game starts at a node. It doesn't have any other branches. So you solve each of the sub games first. So in this first sub game, you see that if I'm at this point, player two chooses between high and low, he's going to choose low because it's better to have 500,000 than 0. If I'm at this node, player two is going to prefer high advertisement because it gives him more money than not advertisement at all. And that means that player one needs to choose between getting into this node or this node. If he goes to the first node, he knows that player one is going to win 1,250K. If he goes to the other node, he knows that he's going to win 500K. So obviously he chooses this node. So here, even if the payoffs have the same structure than the price under dilemma that we saw before, we see that if you have dynamics, if you have a sequential game in which one is the first mover, being the first mover usually gives you a large advantage. And so here, I know that by doing an aggressive, being the first mover in an aggressive advertisement campaign, the other player will have no option. It's better for him to not engage, to not continue doing advertisement, to not replicate the advertisement campaign, and just keep the money from the advertisement and sell a little bit, continue with their sales without spending on advertisement. Yes, I suppose this is all very easy and familiar for you. Yes, so let's think about something that is a little bit more interesting, that is commitment devices, right? So if I have a dynamic game, and so let's use this example. Suppose that you have an entrance choice for a firm. So you have a monopoly, and you have an external firm that wants to challenge this monopoly. And so I'm gonna do a part first of this. You have a firm two that wants to enter into the market, and he can decide to either enter into the market or not to enter into the market. Right? He can decide not to engage in competition. And then you have player one here that can either fight, that is, given that the firm two is entering, I can do a very aggressive campaign, a pricing campaign, a very aggressive advertising campaign, in order to try to dissuade company two from entering the market, or I can, what we can call, accommodate. And accommodate means that I'm not going to reduce my prices so far. I'm not going to do so much advertisement. I'm just going to accept that the other firm gets in. And so the idea is that for me, it would be for firm one, it would be ideal that the other one doesn't enter, so he will get a payoff of 50, and firm 2 will get a payoff of 0 because firm 2 is not entering into the market. If instead firm 2 enters into the market and there is a very aggressive campaign to destroy the winnings of firm 1 or firm 2, sorry, then maybe the payoff of both is going to be negative 10, let's say, right? Because what is happening here is that the incumbent, the firm that was in the position of power initially, decides to very aggressively attack the other firm with a lot of advertisement, reducing their prices, etc. And this is costly, obviously, so it goes both firms. And if I accommodate, then I maintain my position of power. It's less than what I was winning before, and the other firm gets a bit of profit, right? They get a bit of profit. So obviously, as firm 1, I would like the firm to not enter, right? To not enter, and I can make the promise that if you enter into my market, I'm gonna destroy you. I'm gonna do everything that is possible so that you don't win anything. But this is not credible, and it's not credible because obviously when I get to this point, once it's the competing firm gets in, I'm actually going to accommodate. It's not really useful for me to get into a fight for the incumbent firm. So knowing this, knowing that the threats of firm 1 are not credible, and anticipating this, firm 2 is going to enter into the market, right? It should enter into the market, and so the equilibrium should be entering and accommodating, given that entered. So notice how I'm writing this. I'm writing this as the strategy of firm 1 as being conditional on whatever he sees before. So if I see entrance, my best response is to accommodate its entrance, right? So there's a commitment problem. No, there's a commitment problem. There's not a real way of being of threatening the other firm not to enter the market. However, we could imagine something like the firm 1 can sign a contract, and I'm going to put 2 options here. Can sign a contract, so I'm going to put here no contract and contract. And this contract says the following. It's a contract between firm 1 and, for example, it's suppliers. And what it says is that if, and let me draw this correctly. The contract says something like, if sales fall below whatever 30, then I get a fine of 40. So what this tells me is, if I fail to sell as much quantities as I promised, no? If I fail to sell 50 units as I did before the entrance of the other, then I'm going to be punished. And why would I sign a contract like this? Why would I employ this technique? The idea is that by creating this technique, the incumbent, the firm that is dominating, would have such a big punishment if he sells less than the volume that he was used to, that it's going to be more interesting to fight the other company than to accommodate, right? So let's draw the tree completely to think about this. So let's say I have, so this is player 2, and player 2 again can decide to enter or not to enter after observing the signature of the contract, to enter and not to enter. And then I can firm one will decide to fight or to accommodate. So firm 1 will decide to fight or to accommodate. So if firm 2 doesn't enter, the payments are the same. I get my profits of 50. I get my profits of 50. If I don't sign the contract, well, the structure of the payments is the same that in the previous game. So there's no difference. There's no difference with the previous game. If I sign the contract, then if I fight, I get a payment. Oh, actually, it's really bad, right? Because I get like the cost of the fighting, and additionally, I have to pay like this enormous fine, this fine of 40. Let me think if what I'm saying is correct. No, it's not right. I'm gonna keep with the example here. Let's say if I fight, I keep the volume, I keep the volumes of sales, but it's gonna be very costly. And if I accommodate, I'm gonna get so firm 2 keeps with the same payments, but I'm going to have like this punishment, this 20 minus 40, right? So maybe we need to put some hypothetical scenario here where so this is volumes keep over, what did I say, 30, but high advertising costs. Yeah, so sorry for that, but the idea is that I get my device, my commitment device only gets activated when I am accommodating. So I want to find a mechanism that punishes me. My own device, my own commitment is created by making a contract that punishes me if I accommodate with the other player. And by doing that, then we can do backward induction. So for player 1, with no contract is better to accommodate. With contract is better not to accommodate. With contract is better not to accommodate. And in this case, for player 2, in the previous scenario, it was better to enter, because if I enter, I get a payment of 10, and if I don't, I get a payment of 0. For player 2 now, I can get a payment of 0 or a payment of minus 10, right? And given that for player 1, oh, sorry. So for player 2, he's gonna not enter. Sorry, not enter, because obviously getting 0 is better than minus 10, and given that structure of payments, I can end up for player 1 with 20 or with 50. Then player 1 is gonna prefer to sign this commitment device, right? So why would I adopt this kind of restrictive contract, restrictive policy? Is to create for myself a commitment device in which I am forced to fight, to not accommodate the entrance of a competitor. And by signing this kind of contract, I can credibly commit to attack the other one if he enters into my market, and then he is credibly dissuaded from entering the market. Is this clear?
Sí, Joaquín.
I'm gonna stop the recording now.